My resistance finally crumbled, and I collapsed onto the floor in a gentle heap. "Maria," he whispered, his voice trembling with awe, his gaze locked on me. His fingers traced the contours of my body with a kind of reverence, as though he was trying to etch every detail into his memory. And that's how it all began. Before we go further, I'd like to take a moment to ask you to subscribe to our channel and give our videos a thumbs up. Every click you make means the world to us. It fuels our passion to keep sharing stories that matter. If you enjoy what we do, please spread the word and drop your thoughts in the comments. Every interaction helps us build a stronger, more connected community. Stick around until the end. I promise it'll be worth it. Now, let me introduce myself. My name is Maria, and though I say this with a bit of humility, beauty has always been my constant companion. At 65, my curvy frame, smooth skin, and radiant smile still turn heads. My thick, silver-gray hair cascades in soft waves past my shoulders, and my warm, honey-brown eyes seem to hold a mystery that draws people in. Even in my quiet life, one I've kept free of romance since my husband passed, I can't escape the lingering stares and hushed whispers wherever I go. But honestly, none of that matters to me anymore. My life is peaceful, predictable, and I've grown comfortable with it. I've made a conscious choice to steer clear of love. It's not like I haven't had offers. Men of all ages, from silver-haired gentlemen looking for companionship to younger guys who could practically be my sons, have tried to win me over. But I always say no. I tell myself I'm too old for the games of romance, but deep down, I know it's more than that. My heart's been locked away for years. I've lived through loss, and the thought of opening myself up again terrifies me. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I got a call from my nephew, Ethan. Ethan is my older sister's only child, a man in his mid-30s, brimming with energy and armed with a mischievous grin that screams trouble. He's tall, athletic, and carries himself with a confidence that makes heads turn, especially women's. My sister, Claire, has called me countless times to vent about his antics. "Maria," she'd say, "this boy is going to be the death of me. He's always chasing after some woman or another." I'd usually laugh it off, telling her it was just a phase, that young men are often like that. But deep down, I knew Ethan was different. There was something about him, a charm, a magnetism, that made it easy for women to fall for him, even when they knew better. "Hi, Aunt Maria," Ethan's cheerful voice came through the phone. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all," I replied. "What's going on?" "I was wondering if I could crash at your place this weekend. I just need a break from everything." There was a slight hesitation in his voice, and it caught me off guard. Ethan rarely reached out like this. It wasn't like him to ask for a place to stay without a clear reason, especially when his busy social life and career usually kept him occupied. My home, a quiet retreat tucked away from the city's chaos, was cozy and calm, with a garden out back, hardly the kind of place a young man like Ethan would typically seek out for excitement. But there was something in his tone that made me pause. It wasn't just a casual request, there was an unspoken need behind his words. After a moment, I responded, my voice warm with concern and affection. "Of course, Ethan. You're always welcome here. Anytime you need to get away, this is your home too." "Thanks, Aunt Maria," he said, his voice lighter now. "I'll be there by Friday evening." Once we hung up, a wave of curiosity washed over me. What was he running from? Was it a woman? A relationship gone wrong? Or maybe a falling out with his mom? Ethan was always a bit of a mystery, full of surprises and layers that made him hard to read. I couldn't help but wonder what had driven him to seek refuge here and what this weekend might reveal. As Friday approached, the hours seemed to fly by, and before I knew it, evening had arrived. I was sitting in the living room when I heard the unmistakable sound of his car pulling into the driveway. I stood up, eager yet slightly anxious to see him. Opening the door, I was greeted by the sight of Ethan standing there, a familiar yet slightly changed version of the young man I'd known for years. Dressed casually in dark jeans and a fitted black t-shirt that showed off his athletic build, he looked effortlessly handsome. His smile was as bright and warm as ever, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of restlessness, a quiet tension that didn't match his usual confident demeanor. "Aunt Maria," he called out, his voice filled with affection as he pulled me into a tight hug. "You look amazing, as always." I couldn't help but laugh at his charm, a trait he never seemed to lose, no matter how much time passed. "And you're as smooth as ever," I replied, grinning. "Come on in. Let's get you settled." As Ethan stepped inside, his eyes scanned the familiar surroundings of my home. The cozy living room, bathed in the soft glow of ambient lighting, welcomed him. The comforting scent of freshly baked bread still lingered in the air, adding to the warmth of the space. My home had always been a peaceful refuge, a place where one could breathe a little easier. But tonight, as Ethan looked around, I could sense that he was trying to find his place in it, like someone searching for peace in the midst of quiet chaos. What had brought him here? And what was he really hoping to find this weekend? I had a feeling I was about to find out. "Wow," he said, sinking into the couch with a sigh, as if the weight of the world had momentarily lifted. "I've really missed this place." I chuckled, teasing him. "You're acting like it's been years since you were last here." He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly before replying, "Well, it feels like it. Life's been a whirlwind lately, and I haven't had a chance to catch my breath." I raised an eyebrow, my curiosity piqued, but I stayed silent, hoping he'd elaborate. Instead, he just shook his head with a faint smile, as though he wasn't ready to dive deeper just yet. As the evening wore on, we moved outside to the garden. The gentle breeze wove through the trees, carrying the sweet scent of blooming flowers. The peaceful atmosphere seemed to coax him into opening up. We sat there in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves providing a soft background hum. Eventually, Ethan broke the silence. "You know, Aunt Maria," he began, his voice uncharacteristically subdued, "sometimes I feel like I'm stuck in a never-ending loop. The parties, the women, sure, it's fun at first, but after a while, it all just feels draining." His words caught me off guard. This wasn't the confident, carefree Ethan I was used to. The young man who had always carried himself with an air of effortless charm was now laying bare his vulnerability. A wave of concern swept over me as I realized just how much he'd been carrying on his shoulders. I considered his words for a moment before responding softly, "Maybe it's time for a change, Ethan." He sighed, his gaze turning distant as he stared out at the garden. "Maybe," he murmured. "But it's not that simple. People have these expectations of me, you know? It's like I can't step off the path they've laid out for me without letting them down." I moved closer, gently placing a hand on his arm. "Ethan," I said, my voice steady but full of compassion, "you don't have to live up to anyone else's expectations. You're still so young. You have time to figure things out, to live life on your own terms." For a long moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity one hadn't anticipated. There was something unspoken between us, something in the depth of his gaze that made my heart skip a beat. It unsettled me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The weekend flew by in a blur of quiet, serene moments and conversations that seemed to stretch endlessly. Ethan, who had started off reserved, began to relax as the days went on. To my surprise, I found myself growing more comfortable in his company. It was a pleasant shift, one I hadn't expected. But as the weekend progressed, I started to appreciate his presence more than I thought possible. Still, there were these fleeting moments, so subtle yet unmistakable, when I'd catch him looking at me in a way that stirred something deep inside. It wasn't anything overt or obvious, just the occasional lingering glance or a soft, almost secretive smile that felt different. Like there was more being said in those quiet exchanges than words could ever convey. Ethan's stay at my house turned out to be unexpectedly sweet in a way I never could have predicted. He somehow breathed new life into the otherwise quiet spaces of my home. His energy and laughter filled the rooms, and he teased me in a playful, almost boyish way that made me feel lighter, as though the weight of the years had momentarily lifted. There was an infectious quality to his presence that made my home feel alive in a way I hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. One afternoon, as we stood together in the kitchen preparing vegetables for dinner, I couldn't help but smile at how effortlessly he seemed to bring joy into the simplest of tasks. His hands moved with a swift, practiced rhythm, but every so often, he'd pause, grab a piece of cucumber, and pop it into his mouth with a grin that made me chuckle. I looked at him and said, "You're spoiling me," my tone half teasing, half earnest. He shot me a playful wink, his expression warm and sincere. "You deserve it, Aunt Maria," he said, his voice full of affection. "You do so much for everyone else. It's about time someone took care of you for a change." His words settled deep within me, warming me in a way I hadn't expected. It had been such a long time since anyone had made me feel truly pampered, and Ethan did it so naturally, without ever making a fuss. Whether it was brewing a perfect cup of tea in the morning or fixing little things around the house that I'd long since stopped noticing, his actions spoke volumes. He made me feel cared for, appreciated in a way I hadn't experienced in years. And for the first time, I realized just how much I'd been missing that kind of attention. But it wasn't just his kindness that had a profound effect on me. It was also his playful nature that left a lasting mark. His lightheartedness was so contagious, and it often took me by surprise. He had this uncanny ability to sneak up behind me without warning, catching me off guard with a sudden hug or a gentle kiss pressed to my cheek or the back of my neck. Every time he did it, I'd gasp in surprise, only to hear his voice teasing yet affectionate. "Aunt Maria, you're always so serious. You need to loosen up a little." I couldn't help but laugh at his antics, playfully swatting him away. Yet even as I did, I couldn't shake the warmth that lingered long after his hands had left me. His touch, so light but so deliberate, would stay in my thoughts, occupying my mind in a way I couldn't fully explain. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, engrossed in a book, when Ethan suddenly plopped down beside me with his usual carefree manner. Without a second thought, he threw his arm casually over my shoulders, leaning in to peer at the pages I was so absorbed in. His proximity was almost dizzying, and I could feel the warmth of his body close to mine. "Is it a love story?" he asked, his voice low and teasing but with a note of curiosity that only made me more aware of him than I'd like to admit. "It's none of your business," I retorted quickly, my cheeks flushing with embarrassment as I felt the heat of his gaze on me. Ethan chuckled at my response, his laugh rich and deep, and it sent a shiver down my spine. He shifted even closer, his fingers brushing lightly against my arm as he adjusted his position. The brief contact was enough to send a jolt through me, and I immediately stood up, pretending to adjust the curtains in an attempt to hide the sudden unease I felt. "You're too restless," I muttered, trying my best to sound irritated, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "You love it," Ethan replied, his voice dripping with mischief. That grin of his, playful and knowing, made my breath catch in my throat. I didn't respond, choosing instead to turn away from him. But I couldn't escape the feeling that he had somehow unsettled me in a way I hadn't expected. Days passed, but the impact of Ethan's presence was undeniable. His playful touches, the way his eyes seemed to linger on me, and the intimacy in his gestures, so casual yet so deliberate, began to affect me in ways I couldn't control. It wasn't just his words or actions, it was the way he made me feel alive, awakened in a way that I hadn't realized I was missing. I found myself anticipating his hugs, the teasing remarks, the way his mere proximity made me feel a sense of excitement and longing. It was becoming impossible to deny. It was late one night, the house unusually still, the only sounds being the soft hum of the ceiling fan above and the occasional chirp of crickets from outside. I was alone in the kitchen, putting away the dishes, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find Ethan walking in, his muscular chest and arms bare, the dim light from above casting soft shadows across his skin. The sight of him, so effortlessly confident and unguarded, made my heart race, but I couldn't quite place why. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been before, like he was trying to reach through the barrier I'd put up. "Not really," I replied, my gaze flickering briefly to him before quickly looking away, feeling the weight of his attention. He took a slow step forward, closing the distance between us, and leaned against the counter. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes searched mine, waiting for me to meet him halfway. "You've been quiet today," he observed, his tone laced with concern. "Is everything okay?" I nodded, but the tightness in my chest told a different story. There was a tension between us now, thick, almost tangible, that hadn't been there before. I could feel it wrapping around us, pulling me in, and his eyes, like magnets, held me captive. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched on, heavy and expectant, until finally, he broke it. "You know, Aunt Maria," he said, his voice a whisper that seemed to hang in the air, "you're the most beautiful woman I've ever known." The breath caught in my throat. I froze, his words striking me in a way I wasn't prepared for, sending a jolt of something electric through me. My heart pounded, every beat too loud in the stillness between us. "Ethan, don't say things like that," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. My eyes avoided his, unable to meet the intensity there. "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady but with a vulnerability that made it hard for me to push him away. "It's the truth." He took another step forward, his hand reaching out slowly, almost as if he were giving me the chance to stop him. But I didn't. His fingers gently brushed a strand of hair away from my face, and the touch, though soft, was enough to make my breath catch in my throat. The contact seemed to set off a chain reaction inside me, a pull I couldn't ignore. "Ethan, this isn't," I began, but he interrupted me before I could finish. "This isn't what?" His voice was low now, almost a murmur, but it held an undeniable certainty. I felt my heart racing, my mind a swirl of conflicting emotions. I opened my mouth to protest, to say anything to stop this before it went any further, but no words came. Instead, all I could do was stand there, frozen, as his hand slid to my waist. The heat from his touch burned through my clothes, pulling me closer against him, closer than I had ever imagined. I could feel the strength in his arms as they wrapped around me, his body radiating a warmth that seemed to ignite something inside of me, something I had tried to keep buried. The space between us vanished, and all that was left was the rapid beat of my heart and the pressure of his body against mine. "Ethan, we can't," I whispered, my voice trembling. But even as the words left my lips, my body didn't move away. It stayed pressed against his, betraying everything I had told myself was true. His lips brushed lightly against my cheek, so close to my mouth that I could almost feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. The brief touch made my breath hitch in my throat, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Time hung suspended, the moment stretching out until it was unbearable, thick with the weight of our unspoken desires. I don't know how long we stayed like that, neither of us moving, neither of us breaking the silence. All the words that needed to be said were left unsaid, but they filled the space between us, heavy and charged. Finally, I broke away, my chest rising and falling with each uneven breath, my heart pounding in my ears. "Good night, Ethan," I said, my voice barely audible, trembling with emotions I couldn't name. He didn't try to stop me as I turned and walked away, but I could feel his eyes on me, heavy and unyielding, following my every step. It was as if he was waiting for something, waiting for me to turn around, to change my mind. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. That night, I found myself lying awake, unable to quiet my racing thoughts. I kept replaying the moment over and over in my mind. What had I done? What was happening between us? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just a passing feeling, something that would fade with time. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted, and I couldn't ignore it. There was no turning back now. I didn't want to admit it, but it was becoming impossible to deny. I began to crave Ethan's attention in ways I hadn't before, his touch, his presence, the way he looked at me. There was something in that look, something that made me feel beautiful and desired in a way I hadn't felt in years. I kept trying to push the thoughts away, but they would come rushing back, each time stronger, more intense. It felt like a dangerous game, one I knew I shouldn't be playing. But even as I told myself to stop, to put an end to it before things went too far, there was a part of me, an undeniable part, that couldn't help but wonder what might happen if I didn't. What if I let it unfold? What if I gave in to the pull I was feeling? The next morning, Ethan was as carefree and playful as ever, acting as though nothing had changed, as if the night before had never happened. But when our eyes met, there was an unspoken understanding, a spark between us that neither of us could deny. It was subtle, but it was there, lingering just beneath the surface, a silent acknowledgement of the moment we had shared. As the days passed, I could feel the tension growing between us, like a slow-burning fire that was impossible to put out. Ethan's touches became more confident, more intentional, and his words, daring and teasing, had a weight to them that made my heart race. Despite my best efforts to resist, I couldn't help but be drawn to him. The way he made me feel, the way he made me want things I hadn't allowed myself to want in years, was overwhelming. It was as if something was building between us, something I couldn't ignore. And no matter how much I tried to fight it, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. The afternoon heat was unbearable, and I decided a cool shower would be the perfect relief. My room was peaceful, the quiet broken only by the distant hum of the outside world. Sunlight poured through the window, casting soft patterns on the walls, creating a serene atmosphere that felt almost surreal. I had just stepped out of my clothes, the fabric falling to the floor, when I wrapped myself in a soft white towel. Its texture was soothing against my skin, and I could feel the coolness of the fabric as I held it close. My hair was loosely tied back, a few strands escaping to frame my face, giving me an almost unintentional, careless look that only added to the calm of the moment. I was just about to step toward the bathroom when it hit me. I'd left my phone on the coffee table in the living room. It didn't seem pressing. The phone had been ringing nonstop, but nothing had indicated any urgency. It could certainly wait a few minutes. But then, just as I was about to turn the knob, I heard the soft but deliberate sound of footsteps outside my door. The steps stopped just outside, followed by a hesitant knock. "Aunt Maria," Ethan's voice called out from the other side of the door. Before I could even think of responding, the door creaked open, and there he stood in the doorway, holding my phone in his hand. His eyes met mine, and for a split second, he seemed taken aback. "Your phone's been," his words trailed off as his gaze fell to me. I stood there, wrapped only in a towel, my skin still damp from the shower. The steam in the room clung to me, making my bare shoulders shimmer faintly. I saw the shock register on his face, his eyes widening with surprise, and for a heartbeat, he froze. His mouth opened as though trying to finish his sentence, but no words came. In that moment, I could feel my pulse quicken, my heart racing in my chest. The room, which had felt so spacious just moments ago, now seemed to close in around us. The air grew thicker with every passing second. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice almost inaudible. But it was enough. My throat tightened, and I couldn't bring myself to say more. Before I could process what was happening, Ethan moved. His movements were swift, deliberate, and before I even had the chance to comprehend what was unfolding, he was standing right in front of me. His strong hands reached up, cupping my face gently yet with an undeniable firmness. His fingers traced the line of my jaw as his eyes locked with mine, an unmistakable mix of hesitation and something else, something deeper, flickering in his gaze. I felt a shiver run through me, as if his eyes were searching for something within me, a connection that was suddenly undeniable. "Aunt Maria, I can't hold back anymore," he whispered, his voice low and filled with emotion, raw and desperate. And then, without any further warning, he kissed me. The kiss was not what I had expected. It was electric, charged with a force that left me breathless. His lips were soft but insistent, moving against mine with a kind of fierce tenderness that I couldn't resist. For a moment, I stood frozen, unable to react, shocked, stunned. My mind struggled to catch up with my racing heart. But as his hand slid from my waist and pulled me closer, I felt something stir inside me, something that had lain dormant for far too long. A hunger. A deep, aching need I hadn't realized was there until that very moment. "Ethan," I whispered, breaking the kiss just enough to speak. But he didn't let me finish. His lips came back to mine, silencing me with a deep, passionate kiss that left me trembling. Deeper this time. More urgent. The intensity of the moment pressed against us. The towel slipped slightly, its fabric giving way under the growing tension. Instinctively, I clutched it tighter, but Ethan's hands were already there, steady, sure, holding me with such tenderness, like I was something invaluable, something he'd been waiting for. "I've wanted to do this for a very long time," he whispered, his voice raw, filled with yearning, almost hoarse. His words washed over me like a wave, sending an electric thrill through my body. I didn't have the chance to overthink it before my own instincts took over. Without hesitation, my arms found their way around his neck, pulling him closer. Our bodies fit together with an ease that startled me. I kissed him back, the urgency surprising even me, as if this moment had been building for years. The afternoon sun, once warm and gentle, now seemed to blaze hotter, its rays intensifying as we lost ourselves in each other's presence. Time seemed to slow, the world outside fading away until there was only us, tangled together in this stolen, reckless intimacy. Eventually, my towel gave way entirely, falling to the floor in a soft heap, forgotten in the heat of the moment. "Maria," he breathed, his voice thick with awe, his eyes locked onto mine, filled with a depth that left me breathless. His fingertips traced the curves of my body with such reverence, as if he were memorizing every inch of me. Each touch was tender, deliberate. I knew what we were doing was dangerous, forbidden, even. A part of me screamed to stop, to pull away before we crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But in that instant, every ounce of reason, every shred of restraint, melted away. All I could feel was the raw, overwhelming sensation of being alive, alive in a way that made me feel cherished, desired, in a way I hadn't in so long. Ethan held me with a reverence that made my heart swell. His hands, warm and steady, slid down my back, tracing every curve with such tenderness that I shivered. My body responded to his touch in ways I couldn't have anticipated. His lips brushed against my neck, soft and lingering, sending waves of heat through my entire body, leaving me trembling. "Maria," he whispered, his voice low and trembling against my ear. The intimacy of it made my heart race. "You're so beautiful. I've never seen anyone like you." The way he said my name, the tenderness in his voice, made my heart skip a beat. A blush spread across my cheeks, and when I looked up at him, his gaze was locked onto mine, fierce, intense, and full of emotion that left me breathless. Slowly, he leaned in again, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was deeper this time, filled with unspoken promises, passion, and longing that we both seemed to share. As the kiss deepened, Ethan's hands roamed over my arms, my shoulders, down to my waist. His touch was gentle but firm, pulling me closer, enveloping me in his strong embrace as if he never wanted to let me go. I could feel the heat of Ethan's body pressed against mine, his heartbeat steady and strong, echoing in my chest. It reminded me that we were both here, in this moment, together. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice barely audible, trembling with the depth of the emotions rushing through me. But he silenced me with another kiss, deeper this time, as if he couldn't get enough. His lips moved against mine with a confidence that left me breathless. Every touch was more urgent than the last. One of his hands cupped my face, his thumb gently brushing over my skin as his eyes bore into mine with an expression that was both tender and intense, filled with quiet awe. "I've dreamed of this," he confessed, his voice low, thick with emotion. "Of holding you. Of being close to you. You have no idea what you mean to me." His words, raw and vulnerable, made my heart ache in the best possible way, opening a floodgate of emotions I hadn't realized I'd been holding back. I reached up, my fingers trembling as they traced the line of his jaw, marveling at how real he felt, how solid and tangible, as if he could be the answer to everything I'd been missing. "I didn't know I could feel this way again," I admitted, my voice shaking. The vulnerability of the moment made my chest tighten. "You deserve to feel this way," Ethan said, his voice unwavering, filled with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "You deserve to be loved, to be cherished, to feel wanted. You deserve this, Maria." His words wrapped around me like a promise, and in that moment, I realized that I was ready to let go of everything that had held me back. The moment felt almost surreal, as though we were suspended in time, existing in a world of our own. It was as if we were the only two souls in the vast expanse of the universe, connected in a way that transcended everything else. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, casting its golden rays across the room. The warmth of those rays seemed to wrap around us, a soft, comforting embrace that amplified the magic of the moment, making everything feel just a little more extraordinary. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice a quiet hum filled with tenderness. His eyes met mine with such intensity, searching for any hint of doubt or hesitation, as though he could feel the emotions swirling between us, heavy yet unspoken. He seemed to be waiting for some kind of response, as if sensing that something profound was unfolding, a fragile moment teetering on the edge of something even deeper. "I don't know," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper, vulnerable in its honesty. There was a rawness to my words, a truth that I couldn't quite put into context, but I don't regret it. Not at all. A warm smile tugged at Ethan's lips, soft and genuine. His hand reached up, the gesture so natural, as if he had done it 1,000 times before, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. The touch was tender, as familiar as it was reassuring, grounding me in the moment. "Neither do I," he said, his voice simple yet profound, carrying an unspoken promise. It was a promise that lingered between us, like a quiet vow to preserve what we had, to explore the possibilities of what could come next without fear. For a long while, we simply stayed there, side by side, the weight of the outside world completely forgotten. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, yet there was a comforting silence in our proximity, as though we both knew that, for now, this was all we needed. The quiet intimacy of the moment, shared between just the two of us, was enough. In that instant, nothing else mattered. But as time slowly passed and the afternoon light began to soften, fading into the coolness of evening, a subtle shift began to stir within me. The reality of what had just transpired, the weight of its significance, began to creep into my thoughts, breaking through the haze of contentment. The calm that had wrapped itself around me so effortlessly was slowly starting to unravel, replaced by a quiet tension that I couldn't ignore. Later that evening, as the sun slipped beneath the horizon, I found myself standing in the garden alone. The cool evening breeze brushed against my skin, carrying the sweet fragrance of blooming flowers, their scent mingling with the freshness of the approaching night. I sat on the edge of a stone bench, my mind racing, consumed by a whirlwind of thoughts. What did this moment mean for us? What did it mean for the future? Had we crossed a line that, once passed, could never be undone? Could we go back to how things were before, or had we irrevocably altered the fabric of our connection, changed something fundamental that could never be reset? The uncertainty gnawed at me, weighing heavily on my chest. I sat there, lost in thought, the stillness of the evening only serving to deepen the questions I couldn't answer. What was the path forward? Could we find our way back to the simplicity we had known before, or had we irrevocably changed everything? As I sat there, enveloped in the quiet, Ethan appeared in the garden. His steps were soft but deliberate, his presence a calming contrast to the storm of emotion that had been churning inside me all afternoon. He had always had this uncanny ability to still my thoughts, to make everything seem clearer just by being near. Yet, paradoxically, when he was close, the very feelings I had tried to suppress all day came rushing back, impossible to ignore. "Aunt Maria," Ethan began, his voice low but steady, carrying both a softness and an unshakable resolve. His words were carefully chosen, weighted with meaning. "I know this is complicated, but I don't regret a single thing that happened today. And more than anything, I don't want it to end here. Not like this." I slowly turned to face him, my heart weighed down by a swirling mix of emotions that I could barely begin to understand: confusion, desire, guilt, and, undeniably, a deep longing I couldn't deny. His calm demeanor only seemed to heighten the storm within me. His words, though measured and steady, managed to send a ripple of unease through my chest, making me feel more vulnerable than I cared to admit. "Ethan, this isn't just complicated. It's wrong," I muttered, the words slipping from my lips before I could think to stop them. As soon as I said them, I regretted it, but they had already been spoken, hanging in the air between us like a confession. He met my gaze without a hint of hesitation, his eyes burning with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. It was as if he wasn't prepared to back down, not even for a second. "Why?" His voice, though calm, held a trace of challenge. "Is it because of what others might say? Because of the age difference between us?" I paused, taking a deep breath, trying to steady my fraying nerves. The truth was, none of the things I should have been concerned about were the real reasons for my hesitation. It wasn't about the judgment of others or the years that lay between us. It was about something far deeper, something more personal. "No," I whispered, the words barely audible. "None of that matters to me. What matters is how I feel about you. That's what makes this so difficult to process, to understand." His words struck a chord within me, reverberating in a place I couldn't quite articulate. There was an honesty in the rawness of his voice, a sincerity that was both disarming and deeply stirring. I wanted to believe him, wanted to let myself follow him wherever this strange, terrifying journey might take us. But something darker, something deeper, was holding me back: a fear of judgment, a fear of the unknown, a fear of what might happen if I let myself truly feel. The fear of losing control. Days passed, but the tension between us didn't dissipate. If anything, it only seemed to grow, thickening the air in every room we shared. Ethan, as patient as ever, gave me the space I needed to think, but he never let me forget that his feelings for me hadn't wavered. He didn't push, but he didn't retreat either. And despite my best efforts to create distance between us, to bury the feelings that stirred inside me, I couldn't escape the pull. Every time he was near, the gravity of it seemed stronger, impossible to ignore. That moment between us, the heat of it, the unspoken understanding, had changed something. I felt it in the air, the tension that lingered when he was close, thick and palpable, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. I just didn't know if I had the courage to admit it, to surrender to it, or if my fears would win, pushing us further apart, maybe forever. That evening, the air between us felt suffocating, heavy with all the words that had yet to be said. It hung so thickly that I couldn't concentrate on anything else. I sat on the couch, pretending to watch television, but my mind kept drifting back to him, back to everything we had and hadn't said. I hadn't heard him approach, but somehow, his presence filled the room before his voice did. "Aunt Maria," he said, his voice soft, laced with hesitation that quickly hardened into a quiet determination. I looked up, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. His expression was open and vulnerable, yet it held an undeniable strength. His eyes were fixed on mine, searching for something I couldn't quite name, maybe reassurance, maybe understanding, but certainly more. Without another word, he moved closer and sat down beside me. The distance between us, once carefully maintained, was gone in an instant. I could feel the heat of his body radiating next to mine, the warmth spreading through me, electrifying every nerve. "I don't want to keep pretending," Ethan confessed, his voice low but clear, every word charged with emotion. "I don't want to act like nothing happened when all I can think about is you." His words hung between us, heavy and profound, and I felt the weight of them sink into my chest. He didn't look away, didn't flinch, waiting for me to respond, waiting for me to say something, anything. But all I could do was sit there, staring at him, overwhelmed by everything I couldn't yet understand, everything I was still too afraid to admit to myself. "Ethan, this isn't easy for me," I said, my voice trembling slightly, betraying the uncertainty that gnawed at me. "I've spent my life being careful, being cautious, and now, everything feels so different. Overwhelming, even." He looked at me with a tenderness that only deepened my internal turmoil. "Maybe it's time for something different," he said, his voice gentle, soothing. He reached for my hand, his fingers finding mine, steady and warm, a lifeline I didn't know I needed. His touch, simple and grounding, gave me a strange sense of comfort, something I hadn't expected, something I wasn't sure I deserved. I looked at him then, really looked at him. Not just as the charming young man I had known for so long, but as someone who saw me, truly saw me, as more than family, more than just his aunt. He saw me as a woman, as someone with desires and feelings of her own. His eyes held something deep, something raw, something real. And in that moment, I saw all the things I had been too afraid to acknowledge. Something inside me shifted, like a tide rolling quietly through me, leaving a change in its wake that I couldn't ignore, even if I tried. Without truly thinking about it, I found myself leaning toward him, drawn by an invisible force, a magnetic pull that I couldn't resist. I closed the small gap that remained between us, and before I could fully process what was happening, my lips met his. The kiss began as something tentative, soft and almost hesitant, yet it quickly grew more intense, more urgent, as if the world around us ceased to exist. His hands gently cupped my face, his thumbs grazing over my cheeks in a tender motion that sent a shiver racing down my spine. The kiss became something more than just a physical gesture. It was the embodiment of all the emotions we had yet to voice, all the unspoken words we shared. In that kiss, there was a silent promise, one that neither of us had to put into words because we both understood it fully. He kissed me with such intensity, as if I were the only person in the universe that mattered in that moment, the sole focus of his entire being. When we finally pulled away, breathless and wide-eyed, I saw the depth of emotion reflected in his gaze. It was a look that made my heart race even faster, as if it were trying to catch up to the raw, electric connection between us. His eyes were locked on mine, their depth pulling me in even further, sending a thrill through me that made everything else seem distant and unimportant. From that moment on, the dynamic between us shifted. There was no turning back, no pretending that things could ever return to the way they had been before. Ethan and I found countless ways to steal moments of intimacy, quiet, private times that felt timeless. Whether we were in the kitchen, side by side, laughing as we cooked, or strolling through the garden at a slow, leisurely pace, or simply sitting together in comfortable silence on the couch, everything else faded into the background. The outside world didn't matter anymore. Each shared moment felt like a delicate, cherished treasure, more precious than anything else. I paused, taking a deep breath, trying to steady my fraying nerves. The truth was, none of the things I should have been concerned about were the real reasons for my hesitation. It wasn't about the judgment of others or the years that lay between us. It was about something far deeper, something more personal. No, I whispered, the words barely audible. None of that matters to me. What matters is how I feel about you. That's what makes this so difficult to process, to understand. His words struck a chord within me, reverberating in a place I couldn't quite articulate. There was an honesty in the rawness of his voice, a sincerity that was both disarming and deeply stirring. I wanted to believe him, wanted to let myself follow him wherever this strange, terrifying journey might take us. But something darker, something deeper, was holding me back, a fear of judgment, a fear of the unknown, a fear of what might happen if I let myself truly feel. The fear of losing control. Days passed, but the tension between us didn't dissipate. If anything, it only seemed to grow, thickening the air in every room we shared. Ethan, as patient as ever, gave me the space I needed to think, but he never let me forget that his feelings for me hadn't wavered. He didn't push, but he didn't retreat either. And despite my best efforts to create distance between us, to bury the feelings that stirred inside me, I couldn't escape the pull. Every time he was near, the gravity of it seemed stronger, impossible to ignore. That moment between us, the heat of it, the unspoken understanding, had changed something. I felt it in the air, the tension that lingered when he was close, thick and palpable, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. I just didn't know if I had the courage to admit it, to surrender to it, or if my fears would win, pushing us further apart, maybe forever. That evening, the air between us felt suffocating, heavy with all the words that had yet to be said. It hung so thickly that I couldn't concentrate on anything else. I sat on the couch, pretending to watch television, but my mind kept drifting back to him, back to everything we had and hadn't said. I hadn't heard him approach, but somehow, his presence filled the room before his voice did. "Aunt Maria," he said, his voice soft, laced with hesitation that quickly hardened into a quiet determination. I looked up, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. His expression was open and vulnerable, yet it held an undeniable strength. His eyes were fixed on mine, searching for something I couldn't quite name, maybe reassurance, maybe understanding, but certainly more. Without another word, he moved closer and sat down beside me. The distance between us, once carefully maintained, was gone in an instant. I could feel the heat of his body radiating next to mine, the warmth spreading through me, electrifying every nerve. "I don't want to keep pretending," Ethan confessed, his voice low but clear, every word charged with emotion. "I don't want to act like nothing happened when all I can think about is you." His words hung between us, heavy and profound, and I felt the weight of them sink into my chest. He didn't look away, didn't flinch, waiting for me to respond, waiting for me to say something, anything. But all I could do was sit there, staring at him, overwhelmed by everything I couldn't yet understand, everything I was still too afraid to admit to myself. "Ethan, this isn't easy for me," I said, my voice trembling slightly, betraying the uncertainty that gnawed at me. "I've spent my life being careful, being cautious, and now, everything feels so different. Overwhelming, even." He looked at me with a tenderness that only deepened my internal turmoil. "Maybe it's time for something different," he said, his voice gentle, soothing. He reached for my hand, his fingers finding mine, steady and warm, a lifeline I didn't know I needed. His touch, simple and grounding, gave me a strange sense of comfort, something I hadn't expected, something I wasn't sure I deserved. I looked at him then, really looked at him. Not just as the charming young man I had known for so long, but as someone who saw me, truly saw me, as more than family, more than just his aunt. He saw me as a woman, as someone with desires and feelings of her own. His eyes held something deep, something raw, something real. And in that moment, I saw all the things I had been too afraid to acknowledge. Something inside me shifted, like a tide rolling quietly through me, leaving a change in its wake that I couldn't ignore, even if I tried. Without truly thinking about it, I found myself leaning toward him, drawn by an invisible force, a magnetic pull that I couldn't resist. I closed the small gap that remained between us, and before I could fully process what was happening, my lips met his. The kiss began as something tentative, soft and almost hesitant, yet it quickly grew more intense, more urgent, as if the world around us ceased to exist. His hands gently cupped my face, his thumbs grazing over my cheeks in a tender motion that sent a shiver racing down my spine. The kiss became something more than just a physical gesture. It was the embodiment of all the emotions we had yet to voice, all the unspoken words we shared. In that kiss, there was a silent promise, one that neither of us had to put into words because we both understood it fully. He kissed me with such intensity, as if I were the only person in the universe that mattered in that moment, the sole focus of his entire being. When we finally pulled away, breathless and wide-eyed, I saw the depth of emotion reflected in his gaze. It was a look that made my heart race even faster, as if it were trying to catch up to the raw, electric connection between us. His eyes were locked on mine, their depth pulling me in even further, sending a thrill through me that made everything else seem distant and unimportant. From that moment on, the dynamic between us shifted. There was no turning back, no pretending that things could ever return to the way they had been before. Ethan and I found countless ways to steal moments of intimacy, quiet, private times that felt timeless. Whether we were in the kitchen, side by side, laughing as we cooked, or strolling through the garden at a slow, leisurely pace, or simply sitting together in comfortable silence on the couch, everything else faded into the background. The outside world didn't matter anymore. Each shared moment felt like a delicate, cherished treasure, more precious than anything else. Ethan was always thoughtful, always going out of his way, in both grand gestures and small acts of affection, to remind me how much I meant to him. He would surprise me with flowers picked from the garden, their vibrant colors standing in sharp contrast to the peaceful, quiet rhythm of our lives. He would leave sweet handwritten notes tucked into unexpected places, on the kitchen counter, hidden between the pages of my book, always appearing at exactly the right moment to brighten my day. And whenever we were alone together, his hand would find mine without fail, his fingers gently intertwining with mine as though he was holding on to something he never wanted to lose. One evening, as we sat beneath the vast expanse of the starry sky, the cool night air wrapped around us as Ethan turned to face me. His expression was serious, contemplative, as if he was weighing something important in his mind. Despite the chill in the air, the warmth of his presence next to me melted any coldness I might have felt. In that moment, everything seemed to stand still, and I knew that whatever was to come next would be a moment to remember forever. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice calm yet laced with an emotion so raw and unwavering that it seemed to reverberate through the very air between us. "I'm not going anywhere. No matter what comes our way, no matter how many hurdles life throws in front of us, I am here. I am with you. Always. Tears welled up in my eyes, their heat a reflection of the depth his words reached within me. Each syllable hit my heart with an intensity one couldn't ignore, and the weight of them settled there, heavy, yet somehow comforting. I reached for his hand, my fingers trembling slightly as I gripped it with all the strength I could muster, as if to reassure myself that his promise was real. Ethan, you've brought so much light into my life, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion, cracking under the weight of all that had been unsaid until now. I can't even begin to imagine what I would do without you. He offered me a soft, tender smile, one that made my heart ache in the best possible way. It was the kind of smile that carried all the promises of a future filled with shared moments of laughter and tears intertwined. You'll never have to find out, he replied, his voice warm and full of certainty as he pulled me into his arms. And in that moment, as I felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against my ear, I knew with every fiber of my being that we were in this together. Whatever the future held, we would face it side by side. Our love, though quiet in its expression, blossomed into something so deeply personal, so uniquely ours, that it became a cherished secret between the two of us. It was a bond that only grew more profound with each passing day, nurtured in the quiet spaces we carved out for ourselves in a world that often seemed too loud, too overwhelming. We both understood that the world around us might never fully grasp the depth of what we shared, and that was perfectly fine. What mattered was the peace we found in each other's presence, the comfort that existed between us in the silence we often shared. Our hearts, once burdened by the complexities and disappointments of life, felt lighter in each other's embrace. With every touch, every whispered word, every quiet moment spent together, we filled the empty spaces within us with a love so full and rich that it began to overflow, spilling into every part of our lives. Ethan, in his own quiet way, had breathed life back into me. He ignited a spark within me that I had long since thought was extinguished. For the first time in many years, I allowed myself to hope, to believe again in the possibility of happiness, even in the face of everything that had come before. In his embrace, I discovered a love unlike anything I had known, tender yet fierce, gentle yet unwavering. A love that was not only real but uniquely ours. A love with its own rhythm, its own heartbeat. A love that we held close and fiercely protected from the outside world. It was ours to treasure, ours to nurture. And that was all that mattered.